many similarities between the rise and consolidation of Putin as a personalist dictator, and then the progression of his international aggression, with similarities with the rise of Hitler and the consolidation of his power as a personalist dictator in Germany, and then the progression of his aggression in Europe. Right? So in both of these instances, you have relatively unknown people coming to power at a very quick pace, largely on a narrative of historical nationalist grievances about humiliation of losing a war that shouldn't have been lost, and that you need to restore your country that was once great back to this status. And a big part of that is regaining all the things that you lost, right? It's the same basic story. I'm not saying that Putin is emulating Hitler in any way. It's just, this might get to theoretical arguments that world politics generates these types of dynamics that leaders then attach themselves to. And then you see a similar type of progression of aggression with Hitler. The remilitarization of the Rhineland, the annexation of Austria, the annexation of the Sudetenland, then seizing the rump state of Czechoslovakia, happening in March 1930. You see the same type of progression, all of which the international community just doesn't really respond very, only half-heartedly to with respect to Hitler. You see the same type of progression with Putin. The violence that he used in Chechnya shortly after he came to power, the war in Georgia in 2008, Putin's little green men in Crimea in 2014, Putin's involvement in the 2016 U.S. presidential election, and now his invasion of the Ukraine, which he said he was going to do, more or less, and so you see the same type of progression. People like Adolf Hitler, people like Vladimir Putin, they can't not do this because this is the basis of their power. That they come to power based upon this narrative of historical grievances, that they are the one person who can right the wrongs. And a lot of it is myth. What usually happens, certainly happened with Hitler, and has probably happened with Putin, especially since he's been so isolated, is that they become ultimately the first believer in this myth. Right? And so they are actors that are so consumed by this fictional version of themselves that becomes their only reality. So they can't not act this way. So this was inevitable to a certain extent. Because if Putin didn't do these types of things, then his claim to authority would wither away. Same thing with Adolf Hitler. So they can't stop. He can't stop. The idea that Putin has limited war aims, I think most Western states are disabused of that idea. And the idea that Putin can back down doesn't make any sense. It'd be suicidal. Right? That he would effectively be inviting a coup if he backed down. And so I think we're at the point, like Europe was in March 1949, where no one has an incentive to back down. And so then it just becomes a question of what is going to trigger the escalation to general war. And so in 1939, it was the invasion of Poland in September, where Hitler took a final step, and then the Allies said, no, we can't put up with this anymore, we're going to go to war. So what is that step in 2022? It could be Poland again, oddly enough, because Poland is a NATO ally. And so if Russian forces engage Poland, then that will activate Article 5, and then that's how you get a general war between NATO and Russia. So, oddly enough, it could be Poland again that becomes the trigger, or it could be the use of some of these banned weapons that becomes the trigger. Whatever the trigger is, I think that's where we are right now. Is that Putin can't back down, because that would be effectively suicidal. The Ukrainians can't back down, because that would also be effectively suicidal. And why would NATO back down at this point? There's nothing to be gained, because they're aware of these lessons, from the past. The last element that the 1930s informs my reading of this is that despite all of the similarities between Putin, his rise, and his use of aggression, and Hitler, that Russia really isn't the Germany of the 21st century. That Russia really, if we want to keep the historical analogy, Russia is really more the Italy of the 21st century. That, you know, like Mussolini, Putin has grand ambitions to restore a once wonderful, expansive empire, but he finds himself with the harsh reality that Russia is really at best a second-rate regional power. And the fact that Russia can't take over the Ukraine is indicative of this, right? If you were a true great power, you'd be able to take out a country like Ukraine that's right on your border. So what's important about that is that while this situation is fraught with the possibility of a general war between NATO and Russia, what Western leaders need to keep in mind is that Russia, for all intents and purposes, is a sideshow. It's the Italy of the 2020s or the 2030s. It's not the Germany. So who's the Germany of the 21st century? Chinese. And so another important lesson that the 1930s has for Western leaders is don't get distracted with Russia, like we arguably got distracted with war on terrorism, and lose sight of the larger threat, and that's China. As a country that is as revisionist, with deep historical grievances, just like the Russians and just like the Germans, but like the Germans, actually has the power potential to be a peer competitor with the United States. The one country that is likely to benefit the most from a war between NATO and Russia is China. And US and European leaders have to keep that in mind. That if we get bogged down in a land war with Russia, the Chinese are going to benefit handily from that. Because then our pivot back to Asia is going to go out.